There's this thing nobody tells you about hospitals. They're loudest when they're quiet. Not the emergency rooms, those are obvious, all sirens and shouting and sneakers on linoleum. It's the hallways at 2 in the morning, the hum of the fluorescent lights that nobody can turn off, the beep of a monitor 3 rooms down, keeping time like a clock that only counts the seconds someone has left. That kind of quiet, the kind that gets under your skin. This story starts in one of those hallways, CEDARS-SINAI Medical Center, Los Angeles, a Tuesday night in October. A man covered in someone else's blood, carrying the woman he thought he loved through the emergency doors, and a doctor, pregnant, exhausted, and completely unprepared for what was about to walk back into her life. He was a billionaire. She was the woman he'd abandoned 3 years earlier without a single word of explanation. And the woman bleeding in his arms? She was the reason they were about to stand in the same room again. Some love stories begin with a kiss. This one begins with a car wreck on the Pacific Coast Highway and a choice no one should ever have to make. The first thing Richard Calloway noticed wasn't the blood. It was the sound. This wet, sucking noise that came from somewhere beneath the dashboard, like the car itself was breathing wrong. The airbags had deployed and deflated, hanging limp and powdery from the steering column, and the windshield had that spiderweb pattern that meant the glass was done, finished, held together by nothing but stubbornness and the plastic film between the layers. Megan was in the passenger seat. Her eyes were open, which should have been a good thing, except they weren't really looking at anything. They were just pointed forward, glassy, like someone had turned the lights on but nobody was home. There was blood coming from somewhere beneath her blouse. A lot of it, more than seemed possible, and it had already soaked through the fabric and started pooling in the creased leather of the seat. "Meg!" His voice came out wrong, too high, too thin. "Megan, look at me." She didn't. Richard Calloway was worth $14 billion. He'd built Calloway Holdings from nothing, from the cargo docks of Newark, from shelter cots and night classes, and the kind of hunger that doesn't go away even after you can afford to eat anywhere in the world. He'd fired CEOs. He'd tanked stock prices with a phone call. He'd sat across from senators and hadn't blinked. But right now, on the shoulder of the Pacific Coast Highway with the ocean crashing somewhere below and Megan's blood soaking through his shirt, he couldn't remember how to breathe. He yanked off his jacket, pressed it against her abdomen. The fabric went dark almost immediately. A truck pulled over. Some guy, sunburned, baseball cap, work boots caked in mud, ran to the window and said something Richard didn't fully process. Something about an ambulance, about calling 911. Richard was already pulling Megan out of the car, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing, because in that moment she felt like nothing. She felt like air and bones and the fading warmth of someone slipping away. "Drive," he said to the man. "CEDARS-SINAI. You drive and you don't stop." The truck smelled like diesel and old fast food wrappers. Richard sat in the back seat with Megan's head in his lap, his hand pressing the soaked jacket against her stomach, watching her eyelids flutter. The radio was on, some country station, a song he didn't know. The driver kept glancing in the rear view, his face doing that thing people's faces do when they want to say something comforting but can't find the words. Richard didn't need words, he needed speed. CEDARS-SINAI Medical Center, Beverly Boulevard. The emergency entrance with its flat fluorescent lighting and the smell that every hospital shares. That specific cocktail of antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath that's almost sweet, almost metallic. The automatic doors hissed open, and Richard came through them carrying Megan, his shirt soaked red from the chest down, shouting for help in a voice that didn't sound like his. 2 nurses came running. A gurney appeared. Someone was asking questions, name, allergies, what happened, and Richard was answering on autopilot while his hands kept pressing, kept holding, kept doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was refuse to let go. And then he looked up. She was walking toward him from the end of the corridor. White coat, stethoscope around her neck, hair pulled back in that same practical bun she'd always worn during shifts. He remembered that, remembered watching her pin it up in the bathroom mirror of his apartment in the West Village, remembered the 2 bobby pins she'd always hold between her lips while her hands worked. She was moving with purpose, reading something on a tablet, and she hadn't seen him yet, but he'd already seen her. Hand the belly. 6 months, maybe. maybe more, round and unmistakable beneath the white coat. Dr. Clare Ashford, the woman he'd proposed to 3 years ago in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. The woman he'd left without a word, without a phone call, without even the basic human decency of looking her in the eye. He'd sent his lawyer, a lawyer, with an envelope, like she was a lease he was breaking. Claire looked up from her tablet. Their eyes met. 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough for everything to come back. The proposal, the ring, the brownstone in Brooklyn Heights they'd talked about buying, the Sunday mornings reading the Times in bed, the way she laughed with her whole body, the way she'd cry silently, barely making a sound. The morning he sat in his car outside her building and almost went back up and didn't. Claire's face did something complicated, something that started as recognition and traveled through shock and arrived somewhere cold and professional before Richard could even open his mouth. She looked at Megan on the gurney, at the blood, at the lacerations visible through the torn blouse. And whatever she was feeling, whatever earthquake was happening behind those grey-green eyes, she buried it. Just put it somewhere deep and locked the door. "Room 2, she said to the nurses. Her voice was steady, terrifyingly steady. "CBC, type and cross, CT abdomen and pelvis, page Dr. Okonkwo for backup, move." Richard reached for her. "Claire," she pulled away, not dramatically, not with the kind of flinch that would have given him something to work with, just a small precise step backward, like adjusting a surgical instrument by a millimeter. "Mr. Calloway." She didn't look at him. She was looking at Megan's vitals on the monitor, already reading the numbers, already calculating. "If you want her to live, stay out of my way." And she walked into the operating room. The double doors swung shut behind her, with that soft pneumatic whisper that hospitals have, and Richard stood there in the corridor in his blood-soaked shirt, under lights that made everything look worse, and felt something he hadn't felt since he was 11 years old watching his mother put a suitcase in the trunk of a Buick. Helpless. Completely. Totally. Bone-deep helpless. He sat down, not in one of the plastic chairs lined against the wall, on the floor. Right there on the cold linoleum, with his back against the wall and his hands in his lap, still wet with Megan's blood. A janitor pushed a mop cart past him and didn't say anything. An old woman in a wheelchair was parked near the vending machine, asleep with her mouth open. The vending machine hummed. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang and nobody picked up. Richard stared at his hands. He thought about Claire's face when she'd looked at him. That fraction of a second before she'd locked it all down. He'd seen it. The hurt, raw and unprocessed, like a wound that had scabbed over but never actually healed. And then the belly he couldn't stop thinking about. Whose? When? Was she happy? Was someone taking care of her? He had no right to those questions, he knew that. He'd forfeited every right 3 years ago when he'd sat in his office on the 42nd floor of the Calloway building in Century City and told his attorney to draft the letter. He remembered the exact words. "Effective immediately, Mr. Calloway wishes to dissolve the engagement. Any further communication should be directed to..." He'd stopped reading after that, signed it, poured himself a scotch, sat in the dark for 3 hours, and never called her. Not once, not even a text. 3 years of nothing. No explanation, no apology, no drunk 2 a.m. voicemail he'd regret in the morning. Just absence total and deliberate, like she'd been cut from his life with surgical precision. Now she was on the other side of those double doors, hands inside Megan's body, trying to stop the bleeding. His ex-fiancée, pregnant, saving the life of his girlfriend. If God had a sense of humor, Richard thought, it was a cruel one. The fluorescent light above him flickered, once, twice, then held steady. The vending machine hummed. The phone down the hall had stopped ringing. He closed his eyes and waited. The surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Richard knew because he counted. Not consciously, he wasn't watching a clock. But his body kept track, the way it always did when things were out of his control. Each minute landed in his chest like a small stone. By the time the double doors opened and Claire walked out, he had a pile of stones in there heavy enough to sink him. She looked exhausted, not the performative kind of tired that people put on to show they've been working hard, the real kind, the kind that sits in the shoulders and the corners of the mouth and the way someone's hands hang at their sides. Her surgical cap was still on, slightly crooked. There was a smear of something on her forearm she hadn't noticed yet. "She's stable," Clare said. Not to him specifically, to the space slightly to his left, like she was addressing the wall and he happened to be in front of it. "Hepatic laceration. We repaired it. She lost a significant amount of blood, but we transfused 2 units and she's responding. She'll be in the ICU for observation." Richard stood up. His knees cracked. He'd been sitting on that floor for over 4 hours and his body had apparently aged 10 years in the process. "Can I see her?" "Not yet. She's sedated. Tomorrow, probably." "Clare." "Dr. Ashford." The correction was quick, clinical, like snipping a suture. "I'm the attending surgeon on this case. I'll be managing her recovery. If you have questions about her care, you can direct them to me during rounds or to the nursing station." She turned to leave. "Thank you," he said. She stopped, didn't turn around. Just stood there for a second with her back to him, one hand resting on the hallway wall like she needed the support. Then she kept walking. Her sneakers squeaked on the linoleum, those ugly white New Balances that surgeons wear, the ones that look like they belong to someone's grandmother, but apparently save your feet during 12-hour shifts. Richard watched her go, noticed the way she walked differently now, the slight adjustment in her gait from the pregnancy, that unconscious hand on the lower back thing. He noticed and immediately hated himself for noticing. The next 12 days were a kind of purgatory Richard hadn't known existed. Megan was in the ICU, then moved to a private room on the 4th floor. She was healing, slowly, painfully, but healing. And Clare was her doctor, which meant Clare was everywhere. Every morning at 7:15, she appeared for rounds. Every afternoon around 3, she checked vitals. Every evening she signed off on medication adjustments, and every single time Richard was there, he'd essentially moved into the hospital. Not officially. He still had a driver take him back to his house in Bel Air at night, that absurd 7-bedroom monument to loneliness he'd bought, because the real estate agent said it was a statement property. But by 6 a.m. he was back, sitting in the chair next to Megan's bed with a laptop he was barely using and a coffee from the place on 3rd Street that did the dark roast with oat milk, the one thing in Los Angeles he actually liked. The conversations between him and Clare were medical, precise, stripped of anything personal. Her white count's trending down, that's good. "We're reducing the IV pain meds. She can switch to oral tomorrow. The drain output is decreasing. We'll probably pull it Thursday. Underneath every word, though, was everything they weren't saying. It sat in the room like a third person, heavy, breathing, taking up space. The nurses felt it. Richard could tell by the way they exchanged glances when he and Clare were in the same room. The way they suddenly became very interested in adjusting IV lines or checking monitors that didn't need checking. On the 4th day, Richard left a coffee on the nurse's station counter. Medium dark roast, oat milk, no sugar. He didn't write a name on it, but it was the exact order Clare had gotten every morning for the 18 months they were together, and they both knew it. She didn't touch it. It sat there all day going cold until a nurse finally threw it out around 8 p.m. On the 6th day, he brought a chair, an actual comfortable chair, not the plastic hospital kind, and positioned it near Megan's bed on the side, where Clare usually stood during examinations. Because he'd watched her stand for 20 minutes checking charts while 6 months pregnant, and something about that made him want to put his fist through a wall, though he couldn't have explained exactly why or who the anger was directed at. Clare sat in it once, briefly, then went back to standing. On the 9th day, Clare dropped her pen during a chart review. It rolled under Megan's bed. She bent to pick it up, that slow, careful bend that pregnant women do, the one that looks like it involves complicated physics, and Richard was faster. He picked it up and held it out. Their fingers touched for exactly 1 second, maybe less. Neither of them acknowledged it. But Clare's hand went to her belly right after, a protective gesture so automatic she probably didn't even know she was doing it. Megan woke up on the 3rd day, really woke up, not the hazy, drugged half-consciousness of the first couple of days, but eyes open, asking questions awake. She was kind. That was the thing that made everything infinitely worse. Not kind in a naive way, not kind like someone who'd never been hurt. Kind in that deliberate, conscious way of a woman who chose gentleness as a practice, rather than a personality trait. She held Clare's hand during a blood draw and said, "Thank you for saving my life," with tears running down her face. And it was so genuine, so completely without agenda, that Clare had to excuse herself and stand in the bathroom for 2 minutes with her palms flat on the cold porcelain sink, breathing. Because it would have been easier if Megan were terrible. If she were cold or vain or possessive, then Clare could have hated her cleanly, simply, the way you hate someone who's taken something that was yours. But Megan wasn't terrible. Megan was a 29-year-old publicist from Portland who asked Clare about her pregnancy with real curiosity. Was she having trouble sleeping? Had she tried the body pillow? What about the heartburn? Was the heartburn as bad as everyone said? And who, when Clare mentioned offhandedly that she'd been craving pad thai at 2 a.m., laughed and said, "Oh my God, my sister was the same way with her second kid. She ate so much pad thai, her husband said the baby was going to come out speaking Thai." Clare almost smiled, caught herself. Didn't. But Megan noticed other things too. She was sharper than people gave her credit for. Sharper than Richard gave her credit for, definitely. She saw how he sat up straighter when Clare entered the room. She saw how his voice changed, got quieter, more careful, like he was handling something fragile. She saw the coffee on the nurse's station that first week, the one nobody claimed, and she saw Clare not drink it. And she filed both facts away without comment. There was this one evening, the 10th day, maybe the 11th, when Richard fell asleep in the chair next to Megan's bed. His head was tilted back, mouth slightly open, that undignified way people sleep in hospitals, and Megan lay there watching him, not sleeping herself, listening to the beep of her heart monitor and the distant sound of a TV from the room next door. Someone was watching a game show. She could hear the audience clapping, muffled through the wall. She looked at Richard's face, at the stubble he'd stopped bothering to shave, at the coffee stain on his shirt collar he didn't know was there, at the deep line between his eyebrows that never fully went away, even in sleep. She loved him. She knew that. Not in the consuming, destroying way, not the way that burns everything down, in the warm, steady way. The way that makes you bring someone soup when they're sick and laugh at their bad jokes and not mind that they leave cabinet doors open. She loved him the way you love someone you've chosen to make a life with, someone safe. But safe wasn't the same as seen, and Richard, she was starting to understand, had never felt seen by her. Not really. He felt comfortable with her, which was different. He felt easy with her, unchallenged, like a man wearing a costume that fit well enough that he'd forgotten it was a costume. Clare walked past the open door without stopping. Megan turned her head and caught the brief shadow crossing the hallway, the soft padding of footsteps that didn't slow down. Watched Richard's sleeping face twitch, just barely, just the corner of his mouth. We get the sound. She closed her eyes. The heart monitor beeped. The game show audience cheered. The radiator in the corner clanked twice and went quiet. It happened on day 12. Clare was standing at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, updating Megan's chart on one of those ancient desktop computers that hospitals refuse to replace, the ones with the keyboards that stick and the monitors that have a permanent yellowish tint. She'd been on her feet for 9 hours. Her ankles were swollen. She could feel them pressing against the inside of her shoes, that dull ache that had become background noise over the last month. The baby was pressing on her bladder. Her lower back felt like someone had taken a hammer to it while she slept. She was fine. She was always fine. That was the deal she'd made with herself a long time ago. Fine was the baseline. Fine was the minimum. And anything below fine was not an option. The screen blurred. Not gradually. Not like losing focus. More like someone had smeared Vaseline across her eyes in one quick stroke. She blinked. Blinked again. The screen didn't come back into focus. Her fingers stopped typing. There was a buzzing in her ears, high-pitched and steady, like tinnitus but louder, and the edges of the room were doing something weird, going soft, going grey. She gripped the counter. Her knuckles went white. Hey, Clare." That was Priya, one of the OB residents who'd been hovering ever since Clare's belly had become impossible to ignore. She was standing a few feet away with a concerned look that Clare found deeply annoying. "You okay?" "I'm fine. You don't look fine. Thanks, Priya, I'm good. Sit down. I said I'm... The room tilted. Not a lot, maybe 15 degrees, but enough that Claire's hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the counter, and the chart she'd been holding clattered to the floor, and Priya was suddenly right there, one hand on Claire's elbow, the other reaching for the blood pressure cuff that was always hanging on the wall behind the station, like some kind of medical decoration nobody used. Sit. Down. Now. Claire sat. The cuff inflated. Priya watched the numbers. Her face did something Claire didn't like, that specific rearrangement of features that doctors do when the numbers are bad and they're trying not to show it. What? Claire said. 170 over 110. Silence. That's... I was standing for a while. It's positional. Claire. I need to eat something. My blood sugar... Claire. Stop. The labs came back 40 minutes later. Protein in the urine, elevated liver enzymes, platelet count dropping. The OB attending, Dr. Voss, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm that only comes from delivering 4,000 babies, sat across from Claire in the break room and spoke in that measured, matter-of-fact tone that doctors use when they're talking to other doctors who are also patients, which is to say no sugarcoating. Preeclampsia, severe features. You know what that means. Claire knew exactly what it meant. She'd managed preeclamptic patients dozens of times. She knew the cascade, the protein, the hypertension, the risk of HELP syndrome, seizure, abruption. She knew the statistics. She'd cited them in medical journals. Knowing the statistics didn't help when you were the statistic. Immediate leave, Dr. Voss continued. Strict bed rest, daily BP monitoring. We'll need to see you twice a week minimum. If things escalate, we're looking at early delivery. I have patience. You have a baby. Claire's jaw tightened. She looked away, at the break room wall, at the bulletin board covered in flyers for a hospital charity 5K that happened 2 months ago, and a sign about proper hand hygiene that had been there since 2019. Someone had left a half-eaten granola bar on the table. The wrapper crinkled in the air from the vent above. I can manage my schedule. This isn't a negotiation, Claire. I've already spoken to Dr. Reeves. You're off the rotation as of today. She didn't argue after that, not because she agreed, but because she recognized the look on Voss's face, the same look Claire herself gave patients who were about to do something stupid and needed to be stopped. You can't fight that look when you know you'd give it yourself. Richard shouldn't have known. Medical information was private. Hyper was law. But hospitals are leaky places, especially when you're the richest person on the floor and people forget you're within earshot. He was standing near the elevator bank, checking his phone. Calloway Holdings stock was down 3% because he'd missed 2 board calls and the market hated uncertainty, when he heard 2 nurses talking at the station around the corner. Dr. Ashford's being put on leave. Preeclampsia. Severe, apparently. At 6 months, that's scary. She's been working insane hours. I don't know how she does it, honestly. No partner, no family here. Wait, the baby's father isn't... gone. Apparently some guy from anesthesia who turned out to be married. She doesn't talk about it. Richard's phone nearly slipped from his hand. He pressed his back against the wall, his vision narrowing to a point. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. Someone got on. He didn't move. Preeclampsia. Severe. At 6 months. He knew enough to know that wasn't just a complication. It was a threat, to her and to the baby. And she was alone. Completely alone. No partner. No family in Los Angeles. Her father was still in Columbus, probably still teaching history at that same public school. The baby's father was some married anesthetist who'd bailed when it got real. Richard found her in the break room. She was still sitting in the same chair where Voss had left her, which meant she hadn't moved in probably 20 minutes. Her hand was on her belly. Her face was doing math, calculating odds, running scenarios, trying to turn fear into data, because data she could control and fear she couldn't. Who's the father? The question was out before he could stop it. It came from a place he didn't have a map for, somewhere between concern and jealousy and guilt and something else, something possessive that had no business existing after what he'd done. Claire looked up, slow. The way someone looks up when they've been expecting a blow and it finally lands. You're asking me that. I'm asking because you're sick and you're sitting alone in this room and what, Richard? Her voice was low, controlled. Somehow that made it worse than screaming. You're gonna fix this. You're gonna write a check. Call your lawyer. Have him draft up some kind of, care plan. That's your move, right? Send someone else to handle the messy parts. That's not... The father of my baby was a man who told me he was available and wasn't, who told me he was separated and lied, who found out I was pregnant and disappeared without a conversation. She paused, let the words land. So honestly, you two would have gotten along great. Richard didn't move, didn't blink. The break room's fluorescent light buzzed overhead. That specific high-pitched whine that you stop hearing after a while until someone mentions it, and then it's all you can hear. The half-eaten granola bar sat on the table between them like some kind of absurd still life. Claire, don't. She held up her hand. You don't get to say my name like that. Not anymore. You lost that 3 years ago when you sent a man in a grey suit to my apartment with an envelope. Her voice cracked, just barely, just at the edges. I spent 4 hours on the floor of my bathroom that night trying to figure out what I did wrong. 4 hours, Richard. And you know what I came up with? She waited. He didn't answer. Nothing. I came up with nothing. Because you never told me. You just left. And now you're standing in this break room asking me about the father of my child, like you have some kind of right to that information. She stood up. Her hands were shaking. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. Go back to your girlfriend's room. She needs you, I don't. She walked out. Richard stood there. The fluorescent light buzzed. The granola bar wrapper rustled from the vent. Through the window, the Los Angeles sky was turning that specific shade of orange-pink it gets when there's wildfire smoke in the air. Beautiful and wrong at the same time. He sat down in the chair she'd been sitting in. It was still warm. He put his hands flat on the table and stared at them for a long time. These hands that had built things, torn things apart, signed contracts, written checks, held Megan on the PCH, once held Claire in a kitchen in the West Village while she cried about a patient she'd lost. A kid, 7 years old, and he'd just stood there holding her until her breathing slowed. These hands that had never once reached for a phone to call her, not in 3 years. He folded them in his lap. The break room door swung slowly on its hinge, drifting closed but not quite catching the latch. It stayed open by about an inch. Through the gap, he could hear the hospital continuing, the beeping, the pages, the muffled chime of an elevator arriving on the wrong floor. He didn't get up for a very long time. That night, Richard went back to Megan's room and tried to be normal. He straightened her pillows, poured water from the plastic pitcher into one of those terrible hospital cups with the bendy straws, asked if she wanted him to put something on the TV. They'd been watching old episodes of some baking competition she liked, the British one where everyone's polite even when the cake collapses. He was doing all the right motions, hitting all the marks, performing the role of devoted boyfriend at the bedside, the way he performed everything else in his life, competently, convincingly, and completely from the outside. Megan watched him for about 15 minutes before she said it. You loved her. It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with the calm precision of someone who'd spent the last 12 days putting puzzle pieces together and had finally seen the picture. Richard's hand froze on the TV remote. Meg, don't. She said it gently, which was worse than if she'd shouted. I'm not attacking you, I'm just saying what I see. I've been lying in this bed for almost 2 weeks with nothing to do except watch you and Richard. I'm not blind. He sat down, put the remote on the bedside table next to a sad arrangement of flowers his assistant had sent. Carnations and baby's breath, the kind of flowers you send when you don't know the person well enough to know what they actually like. The coffee, Megan said. That first week, the one you left on the counter. I leave coffee for the nurses, It was oat milk, no sugar, dark roast from that place on 3rd. She paused. You drink your coffee black, Richard. You've never ordered oat milk in your life. He didn't respond. And the chair, the nice one you had someone bring up, you put it on her side of the room, not mine, hers. Megan's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. She'd always been like that, and the tears and the composure running parallel, neither one cancelling the other out. And the way you look at her, I mean, honestly, I don't think you even know you're doing it. But your whole body changes when she walks in. Your shoulders drop, your voice gets quieter. It's like, I don't know, like some part of you that's always clenched finally unclenches. The room was quiet except for the beep of the monitor and the hum of the IV pump. Outside the window, Los Angeles was doing its thing. The 101 visible in the distance, a river of headlights and taillights, everyone going somewhere. I care about you, Richard said, and he meant it. He really did. That was the part that made this terrible. He wasn't lying. He cared about Megan. He liked her laugh. He liked the way she danced badly in the kitchen to whatever was playing on the Bluetooth speaker. He liked that she never made him feel like he had to explain himself. But that was exactly the problem, wasn't it? I know you care about me, Megan said. That's the worst part. If you didn't care, this would be easy. I could just hate you and move on, but you do care. You're a good boyfriend, Richard. You're attentive and generous, and you show up. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the one without the IV line. But caring about someone and being in love with someone aren't the same thing, and I think I've known that for a while. I just didn't want to look at it. Megan, who is she to you, really? He could have lied. He was good at lying, not the big, dramatic kind, but the small, erosive kind, the lies of omission that let you move through life without ever having to crack yourself open. He could have said she was just an ex, ancient history, nothing. He didn't. She's the only person who ever scared me, he said. His voice was rough. Not scared not like that. Scared because she got past the walls, all of them, every single one I'd spent my whole life building, and instead of being horrified by what was on the other side, she just stayed. He swallowed. So I left first. Megan nodded, slowly, like she was absorbing something heavy. Why? And Richard, for the first time in maybe his entire adult life, told the truth about himself out loud. Because my father used to hit my mother. Every night, drunk, and she'd just take it, and I'd lie in bed listening through the wall, and I couldn't do anything. The words came out flat, factual, like he was reading from a report, and then she left, when I was 11. Didn't take me with her. Just left. And he, my father, he stayed, and I stayed with him because I had nowhere else to go. He was looking at the floor, a scuff mark on the linoleum, probably from a gurney wheel. When Claire and I were together, I started seeing him, in me. Not hitting, nothing like that, but the anger, the way I'd shut down when she got too close, the way I'd disappear into work for days and not call. And then my father showed up after years asking for money, and I looked at him and I thought, that's me, that's where this goes, so I ended it. I ended it because I thought I was protecting her. By sending a lawyer. Yeah. Jesus, Richard. I know. Megan was quiet for a long time. The IV pump clicked through its cycle. A nurse walked past the open door pushing a cart that rattled. Glass bottles, probably. The little medication vials that clinked together like wind chimes. She's alone, isn't she? Megan said. The baby. There's no one. Richard looked up. How did you... I asked her about the father once, casually, like girl talk. She changed the subject so fast it was almost funny. That's how you know, when someone pivots that quick, the answer is bad. Another silence, longer this time. I'm not going to tell you what to do, Megan said. She pulled the thin hospital blanket up to her chin. Her color was better than last week. The bruise on her cheekbone from the airbag had faded to a yellowish green. But I'm also not going to lie here pretending I don't see what's happening. I deserve better than that. And so does she. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. You're a better person than me, he said. Megan laughed. It was small, watery, and it broke something in the room that had needed breaking. Yeah, I know. Get me some of that pad thai from the place on Wilshire before they close. The drunk one on the corner, not the fancy one. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one passing through on its way somewhere else. Claire went home to her apartment in West Hollywood. Second floor of a stucco building on Sweetser, the kind of building that looked like it was built in the 70s and hadn't been updated since, except for the intercom, which didn't work anyway. The elevator was the size of a phone booth and made a grinding noise on the way up that she'd learned to ignore. She checked her blood pressure. 158/98. Better than the hospital, but not good. She checked it again 20 minutes later because she didn't trust the first reading. 154/96. She wrote both numbers in a notebook she kept on the nightstand, next to a bottle of prenatal vitamins and a half-empty glass of water from last night. The apartment was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The fridge hummed. The faucet in the bathroom dripped, the one she'd been meaning to call maintenance about since October. Through the wall she could hear her neighbor's music, something with a heavy bass line, barely audible but persistent, like a heartbeat. She lay on the bed, on her left side the way the book said, with a pillow between her knees. The baby kicked, hard, right under her ribs, that sharp jab that always made her gasp. "I know," she whispered. "I know. We're okay." They were not okay. At 2 a.m. she was still awake. She'd been scrolling through her phone. Not social media, not the news, old texts. The thread with Richard from 3 years ago, the one she'd never deleted because deleting it felt like admitting it had mattered, and not deleting it felt like admitting it still did. She scrolled past the good morning texts, past the "you up" messages, past the photo he'd sent of a sunset from his office window, past the last message he'd ever sent her, a single line, November 14th, 11th, 23 p.m. "I'll be home late. Don't wait up." She hadn't waited up, and he hadn't come home. Not that night, not ever. She put the phone face down on the mattress, stared at the ceiling. There was a water stain in the corner that looked vaguely like a map of somewhere, Michigan maybe, or one of those states in the middle she always mixed up. The baby kicked again, softer this time. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm against the spot where the foot had been, held it there, tried to picture what the next 3 months looked like, alone, on bed rest, in this apartment with the dripping faucet and the neighbor's bass and the ceiling stain shaped like Michigan. Tried to picture bringing a baby home to this. A crib in the corner of the bedroom, bottles in the dish rack. No one to hand the baby to at 3 a.m. when she was so tired she couldn't see straight. She'd been alone her whole life. She was good at it, practiced. But good at something and wanting it were two very different things. And lying there in the dark with her hand on her belly, Claire finally let herself admit what she hadn't admitted in years. She was tired, not sleepy, not overworked. Tired in the way that goes all the way down to the foundation, the kind that makes you wonder if maybe you built the whole thing wrong from the start. The faucet dripped, the bass thumped, the baby was still. Claire pulled the blanket up and stared at the wall until her eyes stopped burning. 4 days passed. 4 days of Richard splitting his time between Megan's bedside and his own head, which was a worse place to be. Megan healed. Claire stayed home. The hospital kept turning. Megan was discharged on a Tuesday. Richard arranged the car, a black SUV, not the usual town car, because the back seat was bigger and she could stretch out. He sent his assistant to pack a bag from her apartment in Silver Lake. He handled the discharge paperwork and the pharmacy pickup and the follow-up appointment schedule, and all the logistics he was good at, all the machinery of caring for someone that he could manage without ever having to look at what was underneath. Megan stood in the hospital lobby with her bag, her hair washed for the first time in 2 weeks, wearing actual clothes instead of a hospital gown, jeans, a grey sweater, sneakers. She looked smaller outside the context of the bed, more fragile, though she'd never have said so herself. "You're not coming with me," she said. It wasn't bitter, just factual. "Meg, Richard, it's okay." She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, winced. The incision site was still tender. "I've been thinking about this since our conversation the other night, and I know that you need to figure some things out, and you can't do that from my couch pretending everything's fine." A couple walked past them in the lobby, a young guy carrying a car seat with a newborn in it, the mother shuffling carefully beside him. That post-delivery walk that's equal parts exhaustion and disbelief. They both looked terrified and overjoyed. Richard watched them push through the glass doors into the sunlight and felt something twist in his chest. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "Any of it. I don't know how to not screw this up. Every version of this, I screw up." Megan looked at him for a long time. Then she did something unexpected. She put her hand on his cheek. Her fingers were cool. The lobby smelled like floor cleaner and the coffee cart by the gift shop. "That's the first honest thing you've said in a year," she told him. "Start there." The SUV was waiting outside. She walked to it, got in carefully, and the door closed. Richard stood on the curb and watched the car pull into traffic on Beverly Boulevard, merge into the flow of Los Angeles, the city she'd moved to from Portland 2 years ago for a job and a man, and now had neither, and disappear. He stood there for maybe 5 minutes after that, just standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, people streaming past him, nurses coming off shift, a delivery guy with a dolly full of boxes, an old man in a wheelchair being pushed by an aide who was talking on the phone. Then he got in his own car and told the driver to take him to Sweetser Avenue. He stopped at the deli on the corner first, the one with the faded awning and the neon sign that said open, even though it was obvious they were open because there was a line of people in yoga pants buying overpriced smoothies. He bought a bag of things. He wasn't even sure what exactly. His hands just moved along the shelves. Soup, crackers, some kind of sparkling water, a container of cut fruit that looked decent, a chocolate bar because he remembered that Claire used to keep a stash of dark chocolate in her desk drawer and eat a square every night before bed, like a ritual, like medicine. He parked on Sweetser, sat in the car for 10 minutes. His hands were sweating. All those years of boardrooms and hostile takeovers and staring down people who wanted to destroy him, none of it had ever made his hands sweat like this. He went up, second floor, walked down the hallway. The carpet was that industrial grey stuff that never looks clean even when it is, and someone had left a pair of rain boots outside their door, which was weird because it hadn't rained in 3 weeks. He found her apartment. Number 206, he knocked. And then he stood there, holding the deli bag, in a shirt that was wrinkled because he'd been wearing it since yesterday, with stubble because he'd stopped tracking what day it was. Looking, probably, like the furthest thing from a billionaire that a billionaire could look. Through the door, he heard movement. A pause. He imagined her checking the peephole, seeing his face distorted through the fisheye lens. Nothing happened. He should have left. Any reasonable person would have left. You knock on the door of the woman you abandoned, the woman whose heart you broke with a legal document, the woman who's now carrying someone else's child and fighting a pregnancy complication that could kill her. And she doesn't answer. You leave. You go home to your 7-bedroom house in Bel Air, and you sit in the silence you built for yourself, and you accept that some doors don't open twice. Richard didn't leave. He sat down on the hallway floor, right there on the industrial grey carpet, with his back against the wall across from her door, put the deli bag beside him, and waited. Inside the apartment, Claire stood behind the door with her hand on the deadbolt. Her forehead was almost touching the wood. She could smell him, or thought she could. That specific combination of soap and the laundry detergent his housekeeper used, though honestly she was probably imagining it through a door and a wall, but the memory of the smell was enough. She didn't open the door. She also didn't tell him to go away. 5 minutes passed. 10. She moved to the kitchen, slowly, carefully, the way she moved everywhere now, and boiled water for tea. The kettle whistled. She poured it, held the mug in both hands, stood at the kitchen counter and stared at the door. From the hallway she heard a rustle. The deli bag, probably. Then nothing. He was still there. She carried her tea to the door, sat down on the floor on her side. Not easy at 6 months, but she managed, legs stretched out back against the wood. They were probably 3 feet apart, separated by 2 inches of hollow core door and 3 years of silence. "I know you're there," she said. A pause. Then, through the door, muffled, "I know you know. This is insane. Probably. You can't just show up at my apartment. I brought soup. I don't want your soup. It's the good kind, from that deli, the one with the neon sign." A sound escaped her, not a laugh. Not quite, but something close. She pressed her lips together before it could become one. Go home, Richard. I can't. Why? A long silence. She heard him shift on the other side, the carpet rustling. Then his voice, closer to the door now, like he'd leaned his head against it. Because I owe you the truth, and I've owed it to you for 3 years, and I was too much of a coward to give it. So I hid behind paperwork and silence, and that's the worst thing I've ever done, and I've done some bad things. Claire's hand tightened on the mug. The tea was too hot. She didn't care. My father hit my mother, Richard said through the door. His voice was flat, stripped of everything, no performance, no polish, no billionaire cadence, just a man talking to a piece of wood. Every night. For years. And she left when I was 11. Packed a bag on a Tuesday and drove away and didn't take me with her. He stopped, swallowed. I was alone with him after that. 5 years. And I survived it. And I got out. And I built everything you see on paper. The company, the money, the name. But the thing I never built was a way to be close to someone without waiting for it to go bad. Because in my house, closeness always meant someone was about to get hurt. She heard him breathe, a shaky, uneven thing. When I was with you, I felt things I'd never felt. And that should have been good. But all I could think was, what if this is how it starts? What if the reason I love her this much is because I'm like him, and the intensity turns into something ugly? So I convinced myself that cutting you off was protection, that it was the kindest thing I could do. A pause. I couldn't face you. I couldn't hear your voice. Because if I had, I would have stayed, and I was sure that staying meant becoming him. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere on the floor above, a toilet flushed. The pipes groaned through the walls. Claire set the mug down on the floor. Her hands were shaking and she didn't want to spill. That doesn't fix it, she said. Her voice was small, smaller than she wanted it to be. I know. Knowing why doesn't make the hurt go away. I know that too. So, what do you want, Richard? Seriously? What are you doing sitting outside my door? Silence, then. I want to be better than he was. I want to prove that it doesn't. That the cycle doesn't have to keep going. And I know I don't have the right to ask you to believe that, not after what I did. But I'm sitting on this carpet that smells like it hasn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration, and I'm not leaving. Because running is the Calloway move, and I'm done running. Claire pressed her palm flat against the door. On the other side, she heard him do the same, or imagined he did, probably imagined it. The soup's getting cold, he said. I don't care about the soup. I also got chocolate, dark, 72%. Her throat tightened, he remembered. She sat there for another minute, maybe 2. The tea cooled in the mug beside her. The neighbor's bass thumped through the wall. The faucet dripped in the bathroom. Then she reached up, turned the deadbolt, and opened the door. He was sitting exactly where she'd pictured him, on the floor, back against the wall, deli bag beside him, looking up at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not the boardroom face, not the charity gala face, not even the face he'd worn when he proposed. This was the face underneath all of those, the real one, the scared one. Hi, he said. Hi, she said. Neither of them smiled, but she stepped aside, and he stood up, and he walked into the apartment, carrying a paper bag from a deli and the weight of everything he'd never said. The door stayed open behind them, just for a moment. Then it clicked shut. 14 months later. The house was in Pasadena, not the flashy part, not the estates on Orange Grove that looked like they belong in a magazine. This was a quieter street, a few blocks north of Colorado Boulevard, lined with jacaranda trees that dropped purple blossoms all over the sidewalk in spring and made a mess that nobody seemed to mind. A craftsman bungalow built in 1924, with a porch that needed repainting, and a backyard that was mostly dirt and one stubborn lemon tree that produced fruit so sour it could make you cry. Richard had wanted to buy something bigger. Obviously, he'd had his real estate guy send over listings, Hancock Park, Pacific Palisades, a place in Malibu with a view that could stop your heart. Claire looked at the listings on her laptop, sitting cross-legged on the couch in the apartment on Sweetser, and closed the computer. That one, she'd said, pulling up the Pasadena house on her phone. That's the one. It needs work, I know. The kitchen is from the 80s. I know. There's no pool. Richard, I grew up in a 2-bedroom in Columbus, Ohio. I don't need a pool. I need a porch. So they bought the house with the porch. It was a Sunday morning in April, when the scene that mattered most happened. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that would make a good movie poster. The quiet kind, the kind that sneaks up on you while you're not paying attention and settles into your bones before you realize it's there. Claire was in the kitchen. The kitchen they'd redone, not gutted, not made into some minimalist showroom, but fixed up. New counters, the butcher block kind. A gas stove that actually worked. The old tile floor they'd kept because Claire liked the imperfections, the tiny crack near the back door, the spot by the sink where the grout had gone dark from decades of spills. She was making scrambled eggs. Not well. Claire had never been a good cook. And pregnancy and motherhood hadn't magically changed that. The eggs were a little dry, the toast a little too dark. The butter had gone soft on the counter because she'd forgotten to put it back in the fridge last night. The kitchen smelled like coffee, the good kind from the place they'd found on Lake Avenue, that roasted their own beans and had a barista named Marco, who knew their order. The baby was in the high chair. Oliver, 8 months old. A serious baby, and that's what the pediatrician called him, which was code for a baby who didn't smile easily, but when he did it rewired your entire nervous system. He had Claire's grey-green eyes and Richard's jaw, which at 8 months just looked like a particularly determined chin. Right now he was gumming a piece of banana and staring at the kitchen window with an intensity that suggested he was either contemplating the nature of light or needed a diaper change. Richard came in from the porch. He'd been out there with coffee and the morning paper, the actual paper, the physical Los Angeles Times, because Claire had gotten him a subscription as a joke, and he'd actually started reading it, which surprised them both. He was barefoot, wearing a t-shirt that had a small tear near the collar and sweatpants that had seen better days. His hair was messy. He hadn't shaved. He looked nothing like a billionaire. He looked like a dad. "Eggs are burning," he said. "They're not burning, they're caramelized." "That's not what caramelized means. Don't start with me, I haven't had coffee yet. There's coffee on the porch. I'm not going to the porch. I'm cooking." "You're burning." "Richard." He grinned, walked over to Oliver's high chair, bent down and kissed the top of his head. Oliver responded by grabbing a fistful of Richard's hair and pulling with the kind of grip strength that seemed impossible for a human that small. Richard winced, carefully extracted his hair from the baby's fist and grabbed a mug from the cabinet, the one with the chip on the handle that they kept because Oliver had knocked it off the counter once and it had survived. And things that survive get to stay. This was their life now. The eggs and the porch and the baby with the death grip and the lemon tree that made sour lemons and the kitchen that smelled like coffee and burnt toast. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the kind of life that looks good in a frame. Richard still went to therapy, twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, with a guy named Dr. Petrov in an office on Los Robles that smelled like leather and old books. The sessions were hard. They were supposed to be hard. There were days Richard came home and sat in the car in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside, because the things he'd dug up in that office were the things he'd spent 36 years burying, and unburying them took something out of him that he didn't have a name for. Claire still had difficult nights, nights when the anxiety came back, about the baby, about her health, about everything. She'd had a difficult delivery. Oliver came at 34 weeks, emergency C-section 6 days in the NICU. She still flinched when she heard a hospital monitor beep on a TV show. She still checked Oliver's breathing 3 times before she could fall asleep, her hand on his chest in the bassinet, counting rises. 1, 2, 3, 4. Still breathing. Still here. They fought. Not often, but when they did, it was the real kind, the kind that comes from 2 people who have actual wounds and sometimes accidentally step on each other's. Richard still shut down when he was overwhelmed, went quiet in a way that felt like a wall going up. And Claire, who'd spent years being shut out by a man's silence, couldn't always tell the difference between Richard processing and Richard leaving. They were learning. Slowly, The way you learn anything that matters, by getting it wrong and trying again. Megan had moved back to Portland. She'd sent a card when Oliver was born. A simple one, cream-colored, with her handwriting inside. "Congratulations. He's lucky to have you both." Claire had kept the card in a drawer. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because forgiveness is a strange thing, and sometimes you keep the evidence of a wound, not because it still hurts, but because you want to remember that it healed. Richard had gotten a letter from his mother 8 months ago. Judith Calloway, now Judith Brennan, living in Tucson. She'd seen an article about him in Forbes and worked up the courage, or the guilt, to write. 2 pages, handwritten. Richard had read it once, put it in his desk, and hadn't read it again. He wasn't ready. Maybe someday. Maybe not. Claire didn't push. That Sunday morning in the kitchen, with the eggs that were definitely overcooked, and the coffee that was getting cold on the porch, and the baby who had banana in his eyebrow somehow, Richard leaned against the counter and looked at Claire. She was wearing an old T-shirt of his, a Rutgers shirt from college, worn so thin you could almost see through it. Her hair was in a messy bun. No makeup. She had dark circles under her eyes because Oliver had woken up twice last night, and there was a smear of something on her cheek that was either baby food or moisturizer. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Not in the way magazines mean it, not polished, not curated. Beautiful the way a house is beautiful after you've lived in it long enough that every scratch on the floor has a story. Beautiful the way a song sounds the 40th time you hear it, when you know every note and it still gets you. "What?" Claire said, catching him staring. "Nothing. You're looking at me weird. I'm looking at you normal. That is not your normal face." He smiled, reached over and wiped the smear off her cheek with his thumb. She swatted his hand away, but not hard. Not really. "Hey," he said. "What?" "Thanks for opening the door." She looked at him. For a second, neither of them was in the kitchen. They were back in the hallway of that apartment on Sweetser, separated by 2 inches of wood, both too scared to move. And then they were back. Here. In the kitchen with the bad eggs and the good coffee, and the baby who was now attempting to put his entire fist in his mouth. "Thanks for not leaving the hallway," she said. Oliver dropped the banana on the floor. It landed with a soft splat on the tile. Neither of them picked it up. The kitchen window was open. Outside, the jacaranda tree was doing its thing, purple blossoms drifting down like confetti, slow and careless, covering the sidewalk in color that nobody asked for and nobody minded. A dog barked somewhere on the block. A car passed. The lemon tree stood in the backyard, stubborn and sour and alive. The coffee on the porch went cold. Neither of them went to get it. This story was never about a billionaire. Not really. It was about a man who built walls so high he forgot there was a person inside them, and a woman who was so afraid of needing someone that she turned strength into a cage, and 2 people who, against every reasonable instinct, chose to sit on opposite sides of a door and stay. Not every love story starts with a spark. Some start with a wound. Some start with a silence so long you forget what the other person's voice sounds like. And some, the real ones, the ones that last, start when someone finally says the thing they've been carrying for years and the other person doesn't leave. That's not a fairy tale. That's just 2 people choosing each other, over and over, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And now I want to ask you something. If the person who hurt you the most showed up at your door with nothing but the truth, no excuses, no armor, just the raw, unfinished truth, would you open it?